blizzard had swallowed the world whole. What once looked like a peaceful stretch of forest road was now a merciless wall of white, roaring like a living beast. Every snowflake felt like a shard of ice cutting through exposed skin, and visibility had shrunk into a narrow tunnel of swirling frost. In the middle of that deadly storm, fate brought together two lives heading toward completely different ends. On one side stood a stranded widow, clutching her newborn against her trembling chest, surrounded by her 4 terrified children. On the other side, a weary ex-Navy SEAL, traveling alone with a loyal German shepherd, happened to slow down when instinct urged him to look outside his frosted window. That instinct, honed from years of saving lives, would soon become the turning point of everything. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, humanity, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Kindness Thread. Your support helps us bring more real, heart-touching stories to life. What the ex-Navy SEAL saw when he stepped out into the storm was something he would never forget. Through the wall of blowing snow, faintly illuminated by the pale daylight, he saw a woman dragging herself forward with the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her coat was soaked, her gloves torn, and exhaustion clung to her like a shadow. Beside her, 4 small children, no older than 9, were huddled together, shivering so violently their teeth clattered. The littlest one cried weakly, and the mother kept adjusting the thin blanket around her newborn, trying desperately to shield the baby from the cold. The snow around them showed their stumbling footprints, telling the silent story of miles walked without shelter, food, or hope. It was the kind of scene that stripped a person of every layer of detachment and forced the heart to ache. The ex-SEAL felt something deep inside him shift. He had seen battlefields, disasters, and broken lives, but nothing shook him like seeing 5 children and a mother fighting a storm alone. His boots crunched across the snow as he approached. The icy wind whipped against his face, but he didn't feel it, not compared to the urgency burning in his chest. His dog walked ahead, sniffing the air, sensing danger not from the family but from the cold that threatened their survival. The woman looked up at him with eyes full of fear and hopelessness, as though she couldn't tell whether he was a savior or another hardship waiting to happen. Her lips trembled, not just from the cold but from the weight of the past few days. It was written in her face that she hadn't slept, maybe hadn't eaten, and had been holding onto the last thin thread of strength for the sake of her children. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked in the freezing air. She looked ready to collapse. The SEAL didn't need an explanation. The way she held her newborn close, the way the older children clung to her as though she were their only anchor, the way their clothes were wet and thin, it all told a story of survival pushed to the edge. He knew that in a storm like this, exposure could steal lives in minutes. His training kicked in, but more importantly, his humanity did. He extended his arm and whispered through the howling wind, "Come with me." It wasn't an order. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise, a door opening toward a chance at life. The moment the widow stepped toward him, her knees buckled. He caught her gently, guiding her toward the safety of his truck. His dog circled the children protectively as he lifted them one by one into the back seat. Their small hands were freezing, their cheeks red from the bitter cold, and their clothes covered in ice crystals. The mother hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the road, as if searching for the shadow of the men she had lost, the husband whose absence had forced her into this desperate journey. Her eyes filled with tears that froze instantly against her lashes. She whispered a silent prayer, hoping he could hear it wherever he was. Then she climbed into the truck, holding her baby close as the SEAL wrapped a heavy thermal blanket around her shoulders. Inside the vehicle, the heater roared to life, and slowly, the violent shivering eased. The SEAL checked each child for frostbite, his hands steady but gentle. The oldest girl couldn't stop staring at him, half scared, half relieved, as if she had never seen someone step in with such calm, determined kindness. The newborn let out a stronger cry, a sign that warmth was returning to his tiny body. The widow watched the SEAL with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she could feel the sincerity in his actions. It had been so long since anyone had helped her without hesitation, judgment, or conditions. As he drove through the storm, he kept glancing into the rearview mirror. The children slowly leaned against each other, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. His dog rested its head on the lap of the smallest girl, giving her something to hold on to. The widow wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the contrast between her hopeless steps on the freezing road and the sudden warmth of rescue. The SEAL didn't pry or ask questions, he knew pain had its own time to speak. Eventually, the truck pulled into a small cabin tucked between tall pines, its chimney releasing thin spirals of smoke into the cold air. He had been on his way there to rest, gather himself, and figure out what to do with his life after leaving the Navy. Instead, life had brought him the unexpected, 5 souls needing a place to feel safe again. He carried the children inside, one of them clinging to his neck in silent trust. He helped the widow settle on the couch near the fire, offering warm tea and food. As the room filled with heat and the storm outside roared louder, it felt almost symbolic, the world raging beyond the walls while newfound safety bloomed inside. In the hours that followed, warmth seeped back into their bodies, and little by little, the story unfolded. She had lost her husband months earlier and had been forced to leave her home because she couldn't afford it anymore. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, she had believed that walking through the forest route would lead her to a distant town where she hoped to find shelter. What she didn't know was that she had walked straight into one of the worst blizzards of the year. Listening to her, the seal felt something awaken in him, the sense of purpose he had thought he lost long ago. Life had taken many things from him, too, but perhaps this encounter was its way of giving something back. Maybe saving this family was not just a coincidence but a calling. As the fire crackled and the children slept peacefully for the first time in days, the widow looked at him with tears that finally felt warm. She whispered her gratitude, but the seal only shook his head gently, humbled by the moment. In his heart, he knew that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought with weapons, they were fought with compassion. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Thread. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive. Before we end, Speech Balloon special request, comment below what lesson you took from this story. She never expected one evening to change the story of her entire life. Amelia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the faded sweater in her hands, the one she always wore on days when she didn't want to be seen. Her friend had arranged a blind date for her, insisting she needed to get back out there, but Amelia had no desire to impress anyone. She was tired of expectations, tired of judgments, tired of feeling like she wasn't enough. After the heartbreak she had endured just months ago, she didn't believe in romance, let alone the possibility of finding someone who would truly see her. So she made a quiet decision: she would dress as simply, as plain, and as unattractive as possible, just to make sure the evening stayed uncomplicated. What she didn't know was that this small, defiant act would lead her straight into the heart of a man whose life, wealth, and world were far beyond anything she had imagined. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the beauty of real-hearted stories, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, Kindness Thread. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to the world. Amelia wore her old gray sweater, pulled her hair into a loose messy bun, slipped into washed-out jeans, and walked out the door, hoping the date would end quickly. She didn't know that across town, Adrian Hayes, one of the youngest billionaires in the country, was sitting at a cafe table staring nervously at the door. Despite all his money, despite the admiration he received everywhere he went, despite the world seeing him as a man who had everything, he had never felt so unsure. He wasn't used to blind dates. He wasn't used to vulnerability. And he certainly wasn't used to looking forward to something so simple, so human, so delicate. The moment Amelia walked into the cafe, she kept her eyes down, trying to blend into the crowd. But Adrian saw her instantly. There was something about the quiet simplicity in the way she moved, something soft, something real, something he hadn't seen in a very long time. Amelia scanned the tables, spotted him, and braced herself for disappointment. She expected him to judge her appearance, to force a polite smile, to mentally check out. But to her surprise, he didn't. The intensity in his gaze was warm, curious, drawn in as if she was someone worth seeing, not the dressed-down version she wanted to hide behind. They sat across from each other, the warm glow of the cafe lights creating a gentle softness around them. Amelia kept her guard up, speaking cautiously, choosing simple words, expecting the awkward silence that usually comes when two strangers realize they have no reason to meet again. But Adrian listened to her as if her every word mattered. As if her presence itself was something he had unknowingly been waiting for. She talked about her struggles, her doubts, her insecurities, thinking she was oversharing. Yet he found himself admiring the depth behind everything she said, the way she carried pain without bitterness, the way she still found small joys despite everything she had lost. Amelia didn't know that Adrian wasn't interested in her clothes, her makeup, or her appearance. He was captivated by the gentleness in her eyes, the sincerity in her presence, and the quiet strength she didn't even realize she possessed. To him, she wasn't plain. She was the most genuine soul he had encountered in years. He had met countless people, business partners, investors, admirers, but none of them looked at him the way Amelia did. None of them asked him about his experiences without expecting something in return. None of them made him feel human. She didn't know who he was, and that was exactly why he felt safe. As the evening passed, Amelia found herself softening, laughing lightly at one of his stories, feeling warm for the first time in months. She noticed the way he paid attention, the way he leaned forward when she spoke, the way he didn't interrupt or judge. But she kept reminding herself not to get pulled in. She was here only because a friend insisted. He was probably being polite. She felt almost guilty for showing up the way she did, but something inside her whispered that maybe he didn't mind. What Amelia didn't know was that Adrian had already fallen for her, not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but in a quiet, sincere way that he couldn't ignore. He didn't care that she wasn't dressed to impress. In fact, that was the very thing that touched him. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to be someone else. And in a world where everything felt polished, filtered, and superficial, her authenticity was a breath of fresh air he didn't know he needed. Still, Amelia struggled. She kept telling herself she wasn't beautiful enough, not charming enough, not interesting enough for someone like him. She had no idea who he truly was, but she sensed from his confidence that he probably lived a very different life. It scared her. It made her guard return whenever she felt herself opening up too much. She wondered why someone like him would even want to talk to someone like her. Little did she know that while she doubted herself, Adrian was silently hoping she would give him a chance. He wanted to ask for another date but feared overwhelming her. He wanted to tell her she was beautiful, not because of makeup or clothes, but because of the light she carried within her. But he knew she wasn't ready to hear that yet. As they walked out of the cafe, a cool breeze brushed past them. Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, and Adrian instinctively offered his jacket, but she gently shook her head. She didn't want to accept too much. She didn't want to give him the impression she needed saving. But in truth, she was afraid of letting someone in after being hurt so deeply before. Adrian sensed that hesitation but didn't push. He walked with her quietly, simply grateful for the moments they had shared. At the corner of the street, they paused. The soft city lights reflected in Amelia's eyes, and Adrian felt a rush of emotion he didn't expect. He wanted to tell her who he was. He wanted to tell her how much she had moved him that evening. But he knew it wasn't the right moment. Amelia, unsure of what to say, simply thanked him and prepared to walk away, thinking she might never see him again. But as she took a few steps, Adrian called out softly, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for her heart to hear. And in that quiet call, she felt something shift deep inside her. She turned back, saw the sincerity in his expression, and realized that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally seen her for who she really was. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like, comment, and subscribe to Kindness Thread. Your engagement helps us continue creating emotional, meaningful stories that remind the world of compassion and connection. Before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe true love sees beyond appearances? The restaurant was quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of chandeliers that reflected off wine glasses and crisp white tablecloths. It was one of those places where people whispered instead of talked, where laughter sounded like an interruption. Yet, that night, the silence at one table told a story louder than any noise ever could. A man in his early 30s sat nervously, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the menu. Across from him sat a woman, her head slightly bowed, her breathing uneven. They were both victims of something cruel, though only one of them knew it. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the beauty of hearts over appearances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Thread. It helps us spread the stories that remind the world what humanity truly means. His name was Ethan, a single dad who had been through more in 5 years than most people go through in a lifetime. After losing his wife to cancer, he had raised his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, all on his own. Life hadn't been kind, juggling 2 jobs, school runs, and endless bills, but Ethan still carried a quiet grace about him. He wasn't the man who complained, he was the one who smiled through pain, because he knew little eyes were always watching him. His co-workers, however, didn't understand that kind of strength. To them, Ethan was the boring dad, the quiet guy who never went to parties or dated anyone. They thought he needed to live a little. So one afternoon, out of boredom and misplaced humor, they decided to set him up on a blind date. What Ethan didn't know was that it was all a cruel prank, a joke they would record to share in their group chat. They found a kind-hearted woman named Rachel, someone who had spent most of her life being judged for her size rather than her soul. She had no idea she was part of a setup either. To her, it was a genuine date with someone who might finally see her for who she was. When Ethan arrived that evening, he was wearing his cleanest white shirt, the one his daughter called his lucky one. Rachel, on the other hand, had spent hours mustering the courage to come. She had been stood up before, laughed at before, and yet she chose to try again. But when she entered the restaurant and saw three men snickering from another table, phones slightly raised, her heart began to sink. Something didn't feel right. As the date began, Ethan could sense her nervousness. She barely lifted her eyes from the menu, afraid to see pity in his. For a while, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears. Behind them, the men whispered and chuckled, recording tiny clips, thinking they were witnessing another funny moment. But then something shifted. Ethan looked at Rachel, really looked. He saw not what others saw, but what pain had tried to hide. There was kindness in her eyes, the kind that comes from years of being hurt yet still choosing to be gentle. He broke the silence softly, asking her about her day, her work, her dreams. She was hesitant at first, but his sincerity slowly opened her up. They began talking about books, about family, about life's strange ways of testing people. For the first time that night, Rachel smiled. And it wasn't forced. Meanwhile, the three men in the corner continued to record, waiting for Ethan to realize it was all a joke. They were expecting him to walk out, to get angry, or to embarrass her. But instead, something they never imagined happened. After dinner, Ethan stood up, smiled, and asked Rachel to wait a moment. He walked straight over to the table where the men were sitting, their smirks frozen as he approached. Calmly, he placed his phone on their table and said, "I know what you're doing." One of them tried to laugh it off, but Ethan's voice grew firmer, not loud, but the kind that carried weight. "You thought it would be funny to humiliate someone. You thought pain was entertainment. But let me tell you something, the strongest people I've ever met are the ones you mock. People who still show up, who still believe in love, who still choose to be kind even when the world hasn't been kind to them." The room fell silent. Even the background music seemed to fade. Ethan's words weren't shouted, they were spoken with the kind of calm that pierces deeper than anger ever could. "You set me up with one of the most genuine people I've met in years," he continued. "So, thank you, because instead of your joke breaking someone, it reminded me that kindness still exists." He turned back toward Rachel, who was watching, tears brimming in her eyes. Ethan walked back to their table, pulled out the chair for her, and said, "Let's finish dinner. I think I'd rather focus on someone real than on people who've forgotten what that means." The men behind him sat speechless, their laughter long gone. One of them lowered his phone, shame washing over his face. What began as a cruel setup had turned into something far greater. Rachel couldn't stop her tears, not out of sadness, but because for the first time in years, someone had seen her worth without judgment. Ethan smiled gently and told her, "You know, my daughter always says beauty is what makes people feel safe. I think she's right." The evening went on, no longer awkward or heavy. They talked for hours, realizing how much they shared, not just pain, but resilience. Two people who had been broken by life, finding pieces of hope in each other's words. By the end of the night, Ethan asked if he could see her again, and Rachel said yes with a trembling smile. Outside the restaurant, as they said goodbye under the streetlight, the three men who had mocked them earlier quietly deleted the video from their phones. The laughter that had once filled their group chat was replaced by silence, and, eventually, guilt. Ethan walked home later that night, thinking about how strange life could be. A cruel joke had led to something genuine, and maybe that was the universe's way of teaching a lesson, not just to the men who had laughed, but to everyone watching. The next morning, he told his daughter about the dinner. Little Lily listened wide-eyed, then said softly, "Daddy, I think Mommy sent her to us." Ethan smiled, holding back tears. Maybe she had. Weeks later, Ethan and Rachel met again, and again after that. What started as a prank turned into something beautiful, a bond built not on appearances, but on understanding. And when those same men saw them together months later, walking hand in hand with little Lily, they realized that the joke had been on them all along. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Thread, because the world needs more reminders that kindness is never wasted, and love always finds a way back. Before you go, comment below. Speech balloon: kindness is stronger than cruelty. Because sometimes, a cruel setup becomes the beginning of a beautiful story that changes everyone involved, forever.